Joining us now on the program, as she does each and every week for our mental health segment, is Carrie Krawiec, a therapist at the Birmingham Maple Clinic. Carrie, thanks for joining us again this week.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you on. We celebrated earlier on in the week National Siblings Day, and of course, with having a sibling comes often complicated relationships that have a number of different positives, but also can come with a variety of different negatives. So let's just begin with that sibling relationship, because it is such an important part of development for both of those siblings or all of those siblings, depending on the size of the family, while they all have an impact on each other's development, those relationships too can develop over time in a number of different ways. So let's talk about that dynamic between siblings and how that varies from other relationships that do develop over a lifetime.
Sure. Well, probably your sibling relationship is one of the longest relationships you'll ever have. It should, in many ways, extend longer than the ages of your parents, and because you perhaps become married or find a life partner in late adulthood, your sibling is really the person, or siblings are the people in your life who you will know the longest.
And with that, knowing someone that long, knowing someone for your entire life, from the time you're born through both of your lives or all of your lives, that often opens up the door for a lot of complications along the way that can have a variety of different impacts immediately and down the road. And so, what are some of those more typical conflicts that you'll see between siblings that develop over time?
Sure. Well, so I think especially like once you reach adulthood, each kid in a sibship may have different experiences of the parent. They may have different versions of who they think their parents are. They have different ideas about who was favored more, which I think that favoritism is probably one of the most common things in sibling rivalry from childhood through adulthood.
And so for parents, how do you balance that as you're raising these kids? Because that's something that comes naturally, and it's something that's not uncommon amongst siblings, especially in larger families, to see favoritism maybe be there, or at least perceive that favoritism is there, which is enough to have a significant impact on that individual as well as that family dynamic. What can parents do to kind of limit how much of an impact that perceived favoritism may have?
I think, one word, I would say normalize differences for everyone, for parents and for children. I think, like you and I, we've said so many times, happiness equals reality minus expectations. And so everybody has this fantasy, and parents too. Of course, I treat my kids fairly, or I love them equally. But I think what then gets missed is it's such a broad stroke, it doesn't normalize. Of course, there are differences. Parents have personalities, genders, histories. Children have personalities, genders, histories, experiences, traumas. Some people are going to naturally vibe together better. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean more or less love, more or less attention, but it may mean the attention paid to different things is going to feel different to one person than another. That choices are made, that perhaps a choice to give an independent child a lot of independence is a really great choice, but may also leave the side effect of them feeling less included, or less attention paid to them. And that for parents to normalize, these decisions are hard. We make them with the best information we have at the time, and we always understood there would be consequences of feeling one way or another as a result.
Joining us on the program today is Carrie Krawiec, a therapist at the Birmingham Maple Clinic. You can find more information and get in contact with professionals at the Birmingham Maple Clinic by visiting their website at birminghammaple.com. That is birminghammaple.com. Especially in larger families, there's more relationships that are going to be there to balance between those siblings and from those kids to their parents, and then the overall relationship from that family unit. Do you find professionals in the mental health wing, and especially in family therapy, which is more of your specialty within mental health, do you find that as families are larger, those complications become greater or more varied, or does it really just depend mostly on the dynamic of each person's individual relationship?
I think it depends because in a lot of ways, right, there can be sort of multiple families within a family. Families where maybe some children are born before an event and some are after, or some are college age while some are, new. So there may be even sort of different families within the family, and different people who even feel more or less bonded to each other as a result. Sometimes there can be more conflict as a result, and sometimes there can be less because that people have the connections that are meaningful to them and the understandings that are important to them. So I think it really just depends more on, yeah, the sort of the attitude of the family and the messages in the family about where the conflicts lie or who is at fault or to blame or not, and I think if there's a shared experience and shared expectations, then there's less likelihood for conflict.
There's also conflict that comes from between siblings over time, and it can come to blows at critical periods, whether it be in those middle and late teens or in adulthood, especially when extended family comes into the fold from life partners, from kids of their own, and that also changes that dynamic. And so, well, in terms of those sorts of conflicts as they develop over time, how do you best manage those in order to maintain a strong family tie? Because in some cases, that can be a dividing point for these families where siblings no longer have a relationship with one another, or they do with their parents, but the parents then have to balance too. How do we get the family together without bringing a fight into the fold every single time we're together as a unit?
Sure. Like I think if you're kind of mentioning like situations where perhaps like a new member of the family doesn't get along with an existing sibling or something, and there's some conflict there. I mean, I think again, the person who is put in the middle, the sibling who perhaps has to navigate, a conflict between their spouse and their sibling. It really, again, back to this word normalized, right? Is that perhaps the spouse brings some insight or awareness, hey, this isn't what's done in every family, or this is what my perception is of how a sibling or child or adult or parent whatever should behave. And then the spouse can also say, but yeah, but this is like normal in my family, or like that isn't the role that I have with my sister or brother or whatever else. I think just offering education, how did things come to be? There's so much important information, and family therapists can be really useful in this if it's hard to do on the own, is really like understanding a family's history, and not just the generation before you, but maybe even a couple before. How are boys and girls treated perhaps differently? How are older sibling expectations differ from younger ones? Have there been trends across generations? Are there certain personality types that are expected different things or to behave in different ways? Can they be challenged? And what kind of challenge is enough, and that, right, so it doesn't have to be some rigid u-turn change of how we do things, but like, yeah, like maybe that's not necessarily the role I want to play any longer. Educating your spouse, educating your parents, learning from your parents, what was going on in certain times of life. Was there postpartum? Was there, other traumas? What things happen in the history that make the current behavior or the current milieu of a family make sense?
How does this dynamic change, or how do these potential conflicts change or become more complicated in a situation, for example, where there's divorce between parents in the families? Because that can affect obviously all the kids in a variety of different ways, or even in one collective way also. So how does that factor into some of these relationships, especially between siblings, and especially if they're dividing their time between their parents?
Well, absolutely, and I think that differs at different ages and stages, and of course, different siblings are going to have different ages and stages. So, where some may be aware of parent infidelity or substance use, some might not have known that information at the time, or it had been kept from them. Or some are, older and launching, and they're, off at college or something, while a younger sibling is dealing with parent conflict. So, I mean, to really just understand, you have different lived experiences, even if you grew up for the most part in the same house with the same family. Certainly, kind of Shakespearean quote, right? The world is a stage and we're all merely actors. We don't realize sometimes the roles we play, even inadvertently. One sibling may take up some anger or grief with one parent, and another may feel naturally compelled to protect them. Whereas a more neutral approach for both, right, would have been helpful. And we can kind of get sort of like logged into a path that keeps you sort of rigid. You're sort of feel like you're on the track, like the pro parent track or the against parent track, when really there should be some fluidity there. Would be beneficial for everybody, including the parents and the siblings and all those relationships.
And then it becomes even more complicated after a situation like divorce or other ways that a parent may no longer be in the family, divorce, death, or so on. And then you have an even greater complication too if you bring in a step parent and you bring in maybe even their kids from previous relationships as well. So how does that then complicate things, and how would you suggest managing those sorts of relationships where now you have new members of your family coming in? They are not blood relatives of each other, but they are now siblings in some way, shape, or form. That's often a tough relationship to manage.
Sure. I mean, I think, and we've talked a little bit about step parenting, and I think step siblinging would probably fill in the same way, is that, of course, like normalize these experiences, the fantasy or an expectation that it's all just going to be like hunky dory, happy family. Of course, romantic partners have that and want that, and that's the fantasy. But the expectation is, of course, some children in a household are easier going, some are open to like more new friends, more new people, and some people are closed off. That each of those perspectives is okay within reason, and to like normalize, like, yeah, like there's not going to be as much wiggle room with this sibling to have this bond, whereas maybe with another there would. Of course, like really, reducing the comparing yourself to other families. Well, so and so has a step sibling and it's been a wonderful experience. It's like, well, that's one experience, but they happen in a range, and we really just hope for somewhere in that middle space, that often something too good to be true is, and something too terrible is often not as bad as it seems, but somewhere in the middle is what we can really expect.
More information and ways to get in contact with the Birmingham Maple Clinic can be found on birminghammaple.com. You can also send them an email, info@birminghammaple.com, or call them 248-646-6659 for information and consultation. Joining us on the program, as she does every single week for a weekly mental health segment, is Carrie Krawiec, a therapist at the Birmingham Maple Clinic. And as we're managing these relationships within our own families or within our families down the road, or as we're considering, maybe our friends are telling us or our coworkers are telling us about these family issues, how can something like like working with a family therapist play into this and maybe help manage some of those conflicts in ways that may not be possible at home, or may have been tried and tried again in the home environment and are simply not making those breakthroughs?
Well, I love it. It certainly provides structure, provides a space, a little bit of a referee or a mediator, someone who could sort of digest and process the information and not feel so entwined in the problem. So it can maybe perhaps make a reflection that sounds differently than our, when we're with our own siblings, then our actions might go very fast. They might become defensive quickly or accusatory quickly. And a therapist in a therapist environment can help slow it down, so it's not just such rapid fire, attacks at one another, but what's really underneath what each is trying to say. Also, again, offering the reflections of the history, I think coming with curiosity. So often when we approach something with our siblings or our parents, we come from our point of view as fact and we tell them you're wrong, and that blaming can lead to arguments and conflict. But the reality is curiosity. Wait, what led you to see things this way, or what information were you picking up on? What was going on in your life at the time? How do you sort of look at other situations in similar, different ways? Coming with curiosity is going to give you a lot more information than accusation.
And obviously, this would be a yes from you for families that have that mixed family environment. That, of course, family therapy could be helpful in those ways. But how would family therapy maybe be helpful for these new families that are coming together, those step families that are coming together with kids, especially from different mothers and fathers that are now all part of one dynamic, especially early on in those relationships as they're growing those dynamics and trying to create a new family unit?
Sure. Strong families have what we call like shared rules, shared values, shared experience, shared language. So, one thing and shared traditions. So, I think about even like countries, there might be countries that have their own traditions, their own meals, their own, and there might be other countries that have sort of similar but not wholly the same because they derive from that First Nation, but then, created their own space. And I think when a family joins to kind of think, what are our shared rules? What are the rules of this house? Not what happened in the old house, not what's happening in someone else's house, but what can we agree upon as a rule? And I don't just mean rules like, what time you go to bed or something, but just kind of like where we sit in the chairs around the table or something, right? Like sort of what's the customs of our new family. And even when I say shared language, things like inside jokes, having kind of words that mean something that are kind of like a wink and a nod to certain members of the family that maybe other people outside of your family wouldn't understand. But all of those help to create sort of, like I said, this sort of community of people who belong together. And so thinking about, especially a new family, start to think, yeah, like what are the things that are a part of this group that make us us? Do we have like sort of a family slogan or, sort of a family signal that we kind of know means something to us to no one else? And that helps to make people feel bonded, especially as you're starting something new.
Carrie, before we let you go, anything else we haven't discussed yet today that would be important on this topic, particularly of that sibling to sibling or step sibling to step sibling relationship?
I think starting these conversations early and often as parents, modeling, having them as adult children to your parents, consider having them certainly using the opportunity and not waiting till after your parents are gone. So often, so much conflict between siblings happens once the parents are gone, but nobody was really talking about these things. So recognizing that they may be hard to talk about, but also good to talk about. And so spending some time talking about like again what were some meaningful things going on in lives, why did parents make one choice over another, even though it was hard, again, that it wasn't blaming, acknowledging, I both love you, I just want to learn more about this because if I have this information I can understand it more and then move on from it.
Carrie, appreciate you joining us as always and look forward to our next week conversation.
Thank you, so glad for having me.